This Maamar was said by the Rebbe on Shabbos Parshas Koirach Gimel Tammuz Tafshin Yudches. The Rebbe edited the Maamar in honor of Gimel Tammuz Tafshin Memtes. The pasuk says, Hasam, Nafsheinu, Bachaim. Hashem has placed our souls in life. In other words, given life to our souls. And did not allow our feet to stumble. The pasuk in Tehillim, we also say it in Ma'ariv. So the free Rebbe explains in his Maamar from the Chag Agula Yud Beis Tammuz, a Maamar that starts with these same words. In the beginning of his Gula was actually on Gimel Tammuz, because we know the free Rebbe was released on Gimel Tammuz from jail. He was sent off to Kastrama, and finally he was told about his full release on Yud Beis Tammuz. Says the Friedrich Rebbe, that when we say that Hashem is placing our souls in life, giving life to our souls, is clearly referring to a higher form of life that the soul had on its own. So the soul has a certain life, and now Hasam Nafsheinu Baxayim, Hashem is giving a certain new kind of life to the soul. What is the difference between the life that it has on its own and what Hashem is giving it now? That the life of the soul on its own has a certain limitation. You're going to say that even though the nefesh is a living entity in its very core, in its very essence, that's what a nefesh is all about. Which means that the life that the nefesh has on its own is higher even than the life that it gives forth to the body to sustain it. Generally, we know there's two types of chayas that the nefesh gives to the body. There's individual chayas, for example, giving the energy to the eye to see, the ear to hear, etc. There's also a chayas klali, a general life, sustaining the whole life, and this is equal in the whole body as one. Higher than all of that, there is chay be'etzem, just the fact that the nefesh is alive. In its very essence, it's a living being. So what are you telling me, that it's limited? Nevertheless, given this nefesh chay be'etzem nishakadosh baruch hu, it'd be adva nefesh tevazeh she chay be'etzem. Since the fact that the nefesh is alive in its very essence is because Hashem had made that this is the nature of the nefesh. That means this is already a certain limitation, a certain definition for the nefesh. This is the nature of the nefesh, that it's alive, and nature means that it has its limitation. Nature is limited. So when we say Hasam Nafsheinu Baxayim, we mean that Hashem is now giving it a new form of life that's higher than nature. And this is the meaning that Hashem places our souls in life, giving life to our souls, and doesn't allow our feet to stumble, meaning that one is as a result of the other. It's because Hashem is giving us this higher form of life. That's why we don't stumble. Why is that? Says the Rebbe in Siv Beis, why is it that the life that the soul has on its own, even this highest form of life that we call chay be'etzem, that it's essentially alive, and as a result of that we could have still fallen and slipped? It's only because Hashem is giving us this higher form of life. This is why we don't stumble, why we don't slip. And also to understand the connection of all of this to the Geula of Yud Beis Tammuz, because as said, the Friedrich Rebbe said a Maamar Hasam Nafsheinu Baxayim on Yud Beis Tammuz. Yesh lahagdim, we first are going to preface Mashakasav Bereish Parshaseinu, that which is said in the beginning of the parsha. As mentioned before, Gimel Tammuz, the year the Rebbe said this Maamar was on Shabbos Parshas Koirach, and most of the continuation of the Maamar now is going to be focusing on the ideas related to Koirach. And then we're going to come back to our pasuk and the connection of Yud Beis Tammuz, etc. So the pasuk says, Vayikach Koirach. Koirach took, the Tirgim Unclus, but Unclus translates it, V'ispolei Koirach. Koirach separated. The Bekam B'koim Shenemer Vayikach Tirgim Unesiv. Usually, for Vayikach, the Targum Unclus says Unesiv, and he took. The Kan Tirgim V'ispolei, but here is translating V'ispolei, that he separated. So it says in the Sefer Noam Elimelech from Rabbi Elimelech of Luzhensk, that this separation of Koirach is similar to another separation, the original separation, where Hashem on the second day of creation creates the rakia, the firmament, the rakia that separates between the water, the higher water, and the lower water. As we'll see in the continuation of the Maamar, what that means, etc. Tzemach Tzedek explains that this explanation that v'ispalei koirach is similar to the rakia that separates, who al pima de isu bezoyer actually goes in accordance and is based on something that says in the Zohar. The rakia mavdil have a machloikas smaller biyaminachulu. That the rakia that separates between the upper and the lower waters is really the machloikas, the separation or the dispute, if you want, between the left side and the right side. As we'll see in the continuation of the Maamar, that it's going to refer to Gashmius and Ruchnius, Chesed and Gevura, etc., which is the left and the right. Also, another Maamarim will say that generally the higher worlds are connected to Yamin. Spirituality is generally connected to Yamin, as the Razal tell us, not to Yamin or Yubara Shamayim. Hashem stretched out his right hand, created the heavens, referring to spirituality. The left hand and created the lower worlds, the eretz, the more physical things, which is going to be connected to these two types of water, as we will see. Says the Zohar, just like the rakia is separating between the right and the left, this is similar to the machloikas of koirach against Aaron. Again, as we'll soon see, koirach was a Levi, which is more gvura, which is associated with the left, Aaron chesed, which is associated with the right. Says the Rebbe, from this we understand that what's the connection between the ispalei koirach to the rakia hamavdil is not just because it's machloikas. So the moment you say machloikas, it's the same as the original machloikas, as we'll see, quote in a minute from the Medrash, that really any machloikas is connected to the rakia hamavdil, but rather the Rebbe wants to say that this machloikas specifically is very similar to the rakia hamavdil. So inside, he loirak the machloikas is a machloikas shatiyah. He mirakia mavdil. It's not just because any machloikas automatically goes back to that original separation. Kid'isa b'medrash, as in fact the Medrash says, why doesn't it say kitoiv? On the second day of creation, as it says on all the other days of creation, says the Medrash, it doesn't say kitoiv, shaboy nivras machloikas, because this is when machloikas started. Shenemer, as the pasuk says, that this rakia is going to separate between the waters. So one way of understanding it is that the machloikas of koirach and Aaron is connected to the original machloikas, like all machloikas are connected. But the Rebbe says no. If we look at the Zohar is saying it's the same kind of machloikas. It's not just any machloikas. It's a machloikas of the left against the right. This machloikas specifically machloikas koirach b'Aaron, machloikas of koirach against Aaron, he dugmas is similar to v'sharshei, and it all starts off with hamachloikas b'rakia hamavdil, with this machloikas of the rakia that separates. How is it similar? The kamoisha machloikas the rakia hamavdil machloikas smaller b'yamin, because just like there, it was the machloikas of the left against the right. Al derech zo machloikas koirach b'Aaron, so too is a machloikas of koirach against Aaron. The Aaron who bekava chesed yamin. Aaron generally is associated with chesed, with avo, with love, with kindness. Koyanim generally are associated with chesed. The idea of yamin. The koirach sh'haya Levi versus koirach, which is a Levi. Hayim abchinas gvurei smoil. Chassidus explains that this is why the avoid of Leviim is with shira v'zimra, etc. Leviim generally are associated with the side of smoil, with the gvura. Says the Rebbe, v'yesh loisif, the shnei yadim elush with ispalei koirach. These two things that are included in the ispalei koirach. Number one, machloikas in general, any machloikas. The ispalei koirach is saying koirach separated. It's already an union of machloikas. V'zeh shecholak alarim, but more specifically, the fact that he's arguing against Aaron, which we just explained, is the left against the right, or the idea of gevura against chesed. Shayachim zelozeh are really very, very much connected to each other. How so? What is in fact the reason why Machloikas started on the second day of creation? The Rakia HaMavdil is on the second day of creation. Because on the first day, we know that each one of the 6 days of creation correspond to one of the Midos, to one of the Spheroids, the first day Chesed, the second day Gevura, etc. That's why on the first day you have things like water and light, which are more elements to do with Chesed. The second day is the idea of Gevura. So Yom HaRishon Midas HaChesed Yamin, v'Yom HaSheinu Midas HaGevura Smoil. U'mitzad HaGevura yesh nesinas makom l'machloikas. It is Gevura that allows for machloikas. Gevura is often associated with tzimtzumim, with holding back, with withholding some of the oil, giving one only according to what he deserves, being strict, etc., etc. And therefore, this itself, the moment you're saying the chayus, the flow of energy, is not just going in a bleak, vul way, as is in the case of chesed. Gvura means you're stopping the oil. There's a certain concealment, there's a certain symptom. That itself is saying already, there's separation, there's division. Here there's this much oil, here there's that much oil, etc. So that gvura, by definition, is allowing already for machloikas, for the concept of separation, of limitations. Okay, the Isa bezoyer sham, and as the Zoyer in fact says over there, Yemina Yushlemu the Kuluchulu, the Beitalia Kol Shlemu, that on the right side, that's where that Yemin represents the perfection, the wholesomeness of everything. Sort of a bligvul attitude. On all sorts of perfection and wholesomeness are dependent on the Yemin, on Chesed. Kan itar smolo, it's when the left side wakes up. It's when the left side is aroused. Itar machloikas, that's when machloikas is brought about. Says the Rebbe. So now we have two ways of looking at it. When we speak about koirach being associated with machloikas and koirach being associated with gevura, one way, the way we would have possibly thought is, koirach is mainly about gevura. And he's fighting against the idea of chesed, as we'll soon discuss a little bit more, how he thinks that this is a way in avodas Hashem, possibly. But here the Rebbe is going to say that it goes deeper than that. It's not that koirach is gevura, and he's fighting, he has the machloikas against chesed. What we're going to say is that koirach's main inyan is machloikas. And because his main inyan is machloikas, that's why he wants gevura to last. That's why he wants to make gevura the more powerful one, because gevura fuels machloikas. Says the Rebbe, Valpizi yesh loymar sheikar inyan shel koirach machloikas. Koirach's main inyan is really about machloikas. Kemuven gam, he said this could also be understood from the fact she'amar Razal that Razal tell us, kol hamachzik b'machloikas, anyone that keeps up a machloikas, anyone that maintains machloikas, over belav is over on a prohibition. Shenemer, as the pasuk says, v'lo yiyeh kekoirach v'chadasei, someone, a person should not be like koirach and his congregation. What do we see from here? It doesn't say that someone that fights against koyanim is like koirach. Someone that fights against chesed is like koirach. We say if you have machloikas, you're like koirach. The mizesha machloikas eza machloikas shetiyah hu koirach v'chadasi, from the fact that we say that if you're involved in any machloikas, that's like koirach. Muchach, that tells us sheikar inyan shel koirach u'machloikas, that koirach's main inyan is machloikas. Any machloikas. V'zeh shecholak al Aaron chesed v'rotza lasis hagvura sikar, and the fact that he's fighting with Aaron against chesed, the fact that he is gevura and he wants to make gevura the main thing, who shall yedei chizuk l'machloikas, is in order so the machloikas should be able to be maintained. Again, it's not that his main inyan is gevura and a result of that is machloikas. It's the other way around. His main inyan is machloikas and gevura is a result of that. Says the Rebbe v'tzarech lahavin, so we need to understand that a koirach pikachaya, koirach we know is a very, very smart person, a very clever person. Mistaber loimer makes sense to say shamachloikas shaloi al kunas Aaron hoisem neshatah b'darkei avodah, that his machloikas against Aaron was because he made some sort of mistake in his path of serving Hashem. He thinks that this is somehow a correct way of serving Hashem. Ve'enu moving, so it's totally not understood. Lama ratzah b'machloikas, how could he possibly want to have machloikas, to have separation? The fact that he's arguing against Aaron, in other words, if his machloikas would have just been gevura against chesed, efshar levayr, we would have been able to explain. Shekoirach sovar she'avodas Hashem tzricha liyos b'kava gevura. You could have said koirach thinks that it's a more correct way of serving Hashem with gevura. V'lochen cholak al Aaron she'ois avodas b'kava chesed. So he's fighting against Aaron, who's chesed. We know these are different paths, valid paths in avodas Hashem. We know Beis Hillel, for example, was chesed. Beis Shammai was the idea of gevura. We know there's avos Hashem and yiras Hashem. One is chesed, one is gevura. Now, the Rebbe tells us in Tanya to be machmir on oneself, to be strict in his avodas is an element of gevura. So you could say that koirach thought gevura is a more correct way of serving Hashem. But if we're saying the whole point of koirach focusing on gevura was because he wants machloikas, ain't moving. This is totally not understood. Hey, chashav koirach, how could koirach possibly think shemachloikas hu derech ba'avodas Hashem? The machloikas should be a way in serving Hashem. Gam tzarich lav, we also need to understand mashem targum v'ispolei koirach, that the targum uncles translates v'ispolei koirach. And we said that is similar to is represents this idea that he's similar to the rokia, the firmament that's separating between the waters. So here's the question. It seems to be a little bit redundant in the pasuk if the way we're translating it this way. Why? The truth is, the word koirach itself already represents the rakia that separates. The pasuk says in Yecheskel is seeing the vision of the Merkava, the different things that he sees l'mayla, and one of the things he's describing is that he sees the rakia, the heavens, the firmament, ke'eina kerach, similar to kerach, to ice. Now kerach is the same letters, kufreish ches, like koirach. So says the Tzemach Tzedek that koirach, vayikach koirach itself represents this rakia that's separating. But if that's the case, why do I need vayikach koirach to mean? Vayikach meaning separation and being similar to the rakia hamav. Lumaya isafa, the ve'ispalei koirach. What is the word ve'ispalei koirach? Which we said that's a translation for vayikach. How is this adding to the point of rakia hamav? In order to explain all of this, the Rebbe is going to have now a closer look at these two sets of waters, the mayim elyonim and the mayim tachtonim, and the separation between them. Just to mention that the general idea that we're going to speak about is mayim elyonim and mayim tachtonim really being like ruchnius versus gashmius. Says the Rebbe in Siv Gimel. We're going to understand this by first prefacing that which is known regarding this rakia that separates between the waters. The mayim im tainik. What does water represent? Water is pleasure. Water is delight. The fact that water makes all sorts of delightful things grow, all sorts of things of pleasure grow, as the Alter Rebbe tells us in the first Perek of Tanya. Because water itself has this idea of delight and pleasure. So if we have mayim meaning pleasure, so what's mayim elyonim and mayim tachtonim? Mayim elyonim is going to be the spiritual waters. Mayim Elyonim is going to be the spiritual pleasures. Mayim Tachtonim is going to represent physical pleasures. Now, in the beginning of creation, there was no such thing as physical pleasures. Everything was all about Elikus, everything was all about Ruchnius. So, what is this rakia that's separating between the upper and the lower waters? This is like a curtain, a separation. Where now we're starting to separate where there's going to be spiritual pleasures, but suddenly there's something new coming into the picture. There could also be physical pleasures, and that's mayim tachtonim. So what would be the point? Why did the Eibishter make that there should also be able to be physical, lowly pleasures? The reason why the Eibishter made this separation between the upper and the lower waters was all for the purpose that ultimately the mayim tachtonim, the lower physical pleasures, should be able to be elevated to a place that's even higher than where they started off originally. And that is, what's this aliyah? How does this aliyah come about? As a result of the yerida of these physical pleasures coming down here, that itself gives a tremendous desire, a tremendous yearning into the physical things, to want to go up higher, to be able to go up, to be above. As it says, mayim tachtonim boichin, the lower waters cry, anan be'ina lemevik hamamalko. We want to be in front of the king. Perhaps just to add, doesn't say clearly in the Maamar right over here, but it's from the general understanding. This is like we usually speak about the neshama coming down into the guf. What happens as a neshama coming down to the guf? It gets a greater yearning and desire to go up higher. Back into the Maamar. As a result of this itself, it's now going to go up higher than it was originally. And not only that, even higher than the mayim elyonim, than the spiritual waters, the spiritual pleasures. Says the Rebbe, now that we understand that the purpose is that eventually it's going to go even higher, says the Rebbe, this will now clarify to us something that the Razal tell us. This is what the Razal tell us. The reason why on the third day of creation, it actually says twice kitoiv. One is for the water that was created yesterday on the second day of creation, where it didn't say kitoiv. And then the second kitoiv is for what Hashem created on the third day. But the Rebbe says this seems to be very surprising. That which was created on the second day, that which was done on the second day, that separation of the water, was machloikas. So why on the third day are you saying kitoiv about the water of the second day? So the explanation is, we just said the purpose of the mayim tachtoinim is that ultimately it should be able to go up higher. It should be elevated. How is that going to happen practically? That's going to happen through the avodah of the person. The person is going to be maila the gashmiyas. The person is going to elevate all the gashmiyas, the things. As the Rebbe brings in the footnote over here as well, we know that the mayim tachtoinim were promised that they will be used through avodas Hashem, in avodas Hashem through the person in the Beis Hamikdash. We're going to use the salt that comes from the water on the mizbeach for the karbonos. We're going to use the water for nisuch hamayim. So therefore, what happens on the third day? On the third day, the Eibishter takes the water and makes it all gather to one place. So now the water is not covering the whole earth. Rather, the dry land can now emerge, and you have the oceans at the sides. So what happens now? The Bachaim, now the person could come along and do his avodah. Now is where really the ultimate purpose of where the mayim, the reason why it was separated, can now be seen. In other words, once it was separated, as long as they're just separated, so we just see the machloikas, upper waters and lower waters. But the potential for it now to be elevated is happening when the mayim is moved to one side and now leaving room for man to come along and do his avodah to be able to elevate the water. Once there's the ability for this aliyah of the water, now we realize how even the separation of the water was also good, because the whole purpose of it, which is now going to start coming into fruition, is to be nisala to even a greater place than where it was before. Says the Rebbe, based on all of this, on this understanding of the separation of the mayim elyonim and mayim tachtoinim. Again, briefly, the point being is that the reason for the machloikas, for the separation, was that ultimately the mayim tachtoinim should be elevated, should want to go up higher, and eventually it does go higher. Says the Rebbe, now we could start understanding where Koirach's mistake was. Because as we're about to explain, is that Koirach thought that the purpose was that they should remain separated. That there's a certain advantage in the mayim tachtoinim being tachtoinim. Not that it should try to go up and want to be higher. That's where his mistake was. We just started Siv Daled. This now we can understand why Koirach wants machloikas. Because Koirach had a mistaken understanding. Koirach thought that the purpose of them being separated, the mayim tachtoinim from the mayim elyonim, is that there's a certain advantage in the gashmis itself, and the gashmis, the pleasures in it of itself. The shoyrish hagashmi is ulamayla yoyser mishoyrish haruchnis. What could be the understanding that there should be a tachlis in the gashmis itself is because in truth, gashmis has a higher shoyrish than ruchnis. There is a certain advantage, a certain maila, a certain great inyan that finds itself dafke in the gashmias more than in the ruchnias. In the square brackets, the Rebbe gives somewhat of an example for this idea. So in Torah, it compares two psukim that we say. It says, "Ma godlu ma'asecha Hashem," how great are your actions, your deeds, Hashem. And there's Morabu Ma'asecha Hashem. How many are your deeds and your actions, Hashem? So the Alter Rebbe explains in Torah that the concept of Magodlu, the greatness of Hashem's actions, that's mainly seen in the Olam Esel Yodim. There you have great Gili Elikus. So that's more of an union of godless, of greatness, of blikvul. Morabu represents the idea of where you have many different details. That's ribui, that's multiplicity. And where do you have that? That's often in the lower worlds, where you have the creation of things that are l'cha'ira separate and outside of Hashem. The inyan haribui moira al hashlem is the Ein Sof. But the truth of the matter is that where does the Eibishter's greatness come out? Where does the bligvul of Hashem come out? Where does that perfection of the Ein Sof come out? It really is expressed dafka in this world where you have this multiplicity. That's in a certain sense a greater chiddush. Shimei yoysa yochid, that even though Hashem is one and only, who noisig amribi protam, at the same time he can also contain, he can also allow for all these many details. So in other words, Magadlu Masech is a great thing. Hashem's Bligvul or that shines mainly in the upper worlds. But in a certain sense, where do you see more that power of the Ein Sof is dafka in this lowly world. In the Gashmi is the world. And this is what Kairach is thinking. Kairach is thinking there's a certain milo, a certain advantage dafka in the Gashmi is where you see more in a certain sense that amazing power of Hashem. And this is why Kairach wants that Gvura should be the main thing. So the Rebbe explains the following. Let's go back to what we said. We said the lower waters are crying that they want to be in front of the king. What does it mean the lower waters are crying they want to be up above? In other words, the lower waters are appreciating that there's an Indian of Dafka being higher, Dafka being closer to the Ruchnius. In other words, they feel the Maila of the Gilui Elikus, where there's revelation of godliness, the upper worlds, which is represented by Chesed, by Yamin. The Kivin Shagiluyim be Ikar Ba'olam Esoyonim, since Gilui Elikus is mainly felt in higher worlds. So the Gashmi is the things of our worlds which don't feel this great godly revelation, want to leave the lowly state, and they want to be a place where there's much more Gilui Elikus. So they want to be closer to the idea of Chesed, to the idea of Yamin. This is the idea of the cry, the yearning of the Mayim Tachtoinim to want to go higher. And that's the way it's supposed to be. But according to the mistaken view of Kairach, his mistake was that the point is not that the Gashmis should go away from the Gashmis to yearn to be closer to Ruchnius. Rather, Kairach thinks that the point is Gashmis should remain Gashmis, and it should just be revealed that Gashmis is such a powerful force of Hashem that he could create even Gashmis. Hari Adarab. According to Kairach's views, the main point is Gvura. The main point is that it should be the concealment which allows Gashmias to be created. So again, the real reason the Gashmias was separated was that the Gashmias should feel the mile of the Ruchnias and should want to go up. Kairach is thinking that the point is that there should be separation, that the Gashmias should remain Gashmias, should remain down low, and that's the whole Chiddush. Avol Kairach Ta'abazeh, but Kairach made a big mistake about this. Now it's interesting, the Rebbe is not going to say that there's no Mila in the Gashmias. The Rebbe is going to say that at some point this will be revealed, the Mila of the Gashmias. But Kairach, it's going to be L'Asid Lavi. Now there's no Kairach for that yet. Avol Kairach Ta'abazeh, but Kairach's mistake was Ki Gilu Yashoyrish D'mayim Atachtoinim Gashmiyim. Atzmam, to be able to really see the advantage of Gashmias itself, its tremendous power, and its high source, that's going to be La'asid Lavi. But there's a process of how it happens. It doesn't come just automatically. You can't just get right away to the Gashmias itself, seeing the Gashmias in its greatest advantage of the Gashmias right now. There's a process of how that happens. In order to reveal this power of the Gashmias, what first needs to happen is that the Gashmis itself should be able to appreciate and feel the Maila where there is Gilui Elikus. In other words, to have this feeling that it wants to go up and it wants to be removed from its lowly state of Gashmis. That the Gashmis needs to have this yearning and feeling to go up higher. Eventually, ultimately, as a result of the Mayim Tachtoinim, the lower physical pleasures, appreciating the mile of Gilui Elikus and wanting to be in that space, then eventually could also be Nizgala, the advantage of the Gashmias itself. Says the Rebbe, this will also going back to the story of Yom HaSheni and Yom HaShlishi, will tell us why it doesn't say Kitoiv on the second day. This is why it doesn't say Kitoiv on the second day, it only says it on the third day. In other words, based on this idea that Kairach thought, and we say will be in a certain sense lost at Lavi, that there's a certain advantage just in the Gashmis itself, revealing that power of Hashem to be able to create such lowly things as the Gashmis. And this will be revealed L'Asid Lavi. So then, and there's a certain advantage in that, in the fact that Gashmis was separated and made, etc. So why doesn't it say Ki Toiv on the second day? Again, for the same reason. Because to be able to really see that advantage, to be able to see the advantage in the lowly Gashmis, will only be able to be appreciated and see loss and loving. But now the purpose of the water is that the lower water is that it should be elevated above, and it should have this yearning to be elevated above. The Inyan is that and that aspect of it is only going to come about on the third day, when there is the ability for avodas Adam. Says the Rebbe, that's why it doesn't say on the second day Ki Toiv, because right now that Toiv is totally not accessible. Says the Rebbe, Val derech zel b'chlolo so Inyan the gilui shoyresh hachesed v'tzimtzum shoyresh hagvura the hamayla sheba tzimtzum atzmo yizgala rak la'ased lovei. The Rebbe connects this with a more general idea of what we know, the idea of Gilui and Tzimtzum. So we know that there's the idea of Gilui Elikus, which is generally the mode of Chesed. We know there's the concept of Tzimtzum, that Hashem hides His great Oir, which is more the idea of Gvura basically. Right now, the way we look at Tzimtzum is only that there's a Tzimtzum, there's a certain contraction, a certain concealment of the Oir. The purpose of it is so that you should be able to have a certain oir shining. In other words, the tzimtzum is just there in order to be able to get to some greater gilui. That's what the purpose of the tzimtzum is. Now, there's another aspect of tzimtzum. There's a certain aspect that we're revealing the greatness of what's happening in Gashmis itself. In other words, in a place where there's the limitation itself, the tzimtzum aspect itself. But again, this will only be able to be seen la'as and lovely. Right now, the way we viewed Tzimtzum, the only way to view Tzimtzum nowadays is only that the Tzimtzum is supposed to be leading to a form of a Gilui. The Rebbe explains this now in a way that's much more practical in a certain sense, in Avodas Hashem and how it all relates to our Avodah. Says the Rebbe in Seif Hey, similarly is in Avodas Adam as well. That is, even though there is a certain advantage in the avodah of b'chol drochecha de'eyu over the avodah of Torah mitzvahs. So just to clarify this, just a couple of short points. We know that generally in avodas Hashem there's a few ideas. Number one, of course, is the idea of Torah and mitzvahs, learning Torah and doing mitzvahs. In this area, a person is directly connected purely with kedusha. That's the focus. Doing the Eibishter's Ratzon and Torah and mitzvahs. We also know there's a concept called Kol Ma'asechel L'Shem Shamayim and B'chol Drochecha De'eyu. Generally, the difference between these two is Kol Ma'asechel L'Shem Shamayim is I'm involved in doing a Gashmi thing, but I'm remembering and aware that a Gashmi thing that I'm doing is in order to help me serve the Eibishter in my Torah and mitzvah. So for example, my food, my drink, my sleep is in order for me to be able to have chayas, to be able to learn and daven and give tzedakah, etc., etc., etc. That's Kol Ma'asechel L'Shem Shamayim. B'chol Drochecha De'eyu is another element. In a certain sense, even a deeper thing, that it's not only about my gashmis enabling me to do ruchnis, but really finding the Elokus, being able to recognize Hashem, finding Hashem in all of the gashmis itself. So examples for this could be the idea of the concept of seeing hashgacha pratis in the gashmis, the things that one does, realizing that when he's eating something, there's a godly spark in it, and he's elevating it, etc., etc. In other words, recognizing elikus within the gashmis itself, not only the gashmis to lead to ruchnius, but finding Hashem even in the gashmis itself. Now, in other sichos and maamorim, the Rebbe explains that there's a certain advantage in this avodah b'chol drochecha de'eyu over the avodah, the regular avodah of Torah and mitzvahs. The advantage of finding elikus and getting to know Hashem even in the very gashmis itself. So let's just start the seif again. So the Rebbe says, in avodas Hashem, v'aderech zeu ba'avodas Adam, shagam sheyesh yisroin ba'avodah b'chol drochecha de'eyu al avodah the Torah mitzvahs, even though there is a certain advantage in this avodah of getting to know Hashem, even in all of the regular mundane things that we do, and in a certain sense, this has even an advantage of dealing with inyanim of kedusha in a direct way. The advantage is because here you're getting to know Hashem even in all worldly matters and mundane things, which is called b'chol drochecha in your own personal ways that you're doing. Mikol Bachaim, nevertheless, בכדי שאיסקוי בדברי הרשוס דרכיך יהיה באופן, שענייני העולם לא יפלו בירידה חס ושלום, but in order for a person to make sure that the gashmis of the world doesn't drag him down, doesn't cause a descent in the person chas v'shalom. V'adarabba bohem atzmam yira hashgacha pratis do'eyu, and on the contrary, he should be able to see godliness in all of his ways. He should see the hashgacha pratis and everything. Hu ha'yedei ha'avoida dekol ma'asechi l'shem shamayim. In other words, like this. A person can get very, very carried away, understanding that Gashmis is such an important place where he could find Hashem, and seeing Hashem in every area of the Gashmis, he could get very, very carried away with the Gashmis and forgetting really that it's really all about Hashem. And it could end up being that the Gashmis should actually end up dragging him down, and he just gets more and more involved in the Gashmis, because Gashmis itself is such a great thing in his mind. Says the Rebbe, in order to make sure that the Gashmis doesn't pull you down, and instead you should be able to see the godliness and everything, again, there's a process over here. There's a certain seder. The way it has to work is at first you need to realize that all Gashmis is there for the Ruchnius. And that's the avoid of Kol Masech L'Shem Shamayim. Meaning, so a person is going to business and doing things, he always has to know, I'm doing this in order to help me do Torah and mitzvahs. Furthermore, the Rebbe says, if the only reason I'm involved in Gashmis is so that it should help me for my Torah and mitzvahs, so I'm going to minimize in the Gashmis as much as possible. I'm going to do only as much as necessary, because the tachlis of everything is that it should lead me to Torah and mitzvahs. So then, even when I'm the little bit that I am involved in the worldly matters, I'll be able to reveal the godliness in it. I'll be able to see the godliness, and I'll be able to see this idea of b'chol drachecha da'eyu. Whereas, again, if the person is just seeing the Gashmis, that this itself is such an amazing creation by Hashem, what can end up happening is he's just going to be more and more and more and more involved in Gashmis, not reducing in the Gashmis, as we just said, to the extent that the Gashmis is actually going to drag him down. So again, it needs to be first, Kol Ma'asechel L'Shem Shamayim, doing it for the sake of Torah and mitzvahs, to help you serve Hashem, then you can get to the state of B'chol D'Rochecha D'Eyu. This is similar again to the point we were speaking before about the Gashmis versus Ruchnis in Koirach's way of thinking. Just to recap, to go back to the point we were saying, is that Koirach thinks that the Gashmis is all about, the focus is the Gashmis. Gashmis itself has an amazing, amazing power of Hashem. There's a certain truth to that, which will be Nizgalal Asid Lavoi. But in order to make sure that the Gashmis doesn't drag us down, and in order to be able to get to that greatness of the Gashmis, it only comes by first focusing on the Ruchnis, that the Gashmis has to have this yearning to always go higher and higher. Mayim tachtoinim, that the lower waters are crying. Anan bein elev meve kam malko, we want Gilui Elikus. Then, as a result of that, you can ultimately discover the godliness even in the Gashmis as well. Be'ezus Hashem, to continue in the next shiur.